Hello, Acceleration Nation. I'm really excited for this podcast that you're about to hear with Mita Mallick. Pretty much everybody that I meet nowadays, I met Mita on LinkedIn, and she has such an impressive career. First starting with her education, going to Columbia University, then Duke for her MBA. She worked at some really impressive companies, including Unilever, Avon, Johnson & Johnson, and she has become a very influential person on LinkedIn platform regarding diversity, inclusion, and getting a seat at the table for Black and brown people, especially women. I learned a lot from her in this conversation. I think you will too, about some of the myths out there about diversity and inclusion and about some of the things that white people can do as an ally to help individuals out, and as people of color and underrepresented groups can be aware of as they're navigating their career, as they're looking to get a job, as they're looking to get promoted. So I think you'll learn lots here. You're going to enjoy this conversation. And as a last reminder, if you are ever looking to accelerate your career, if you're looking to get a better job quickly, confidently, with lots more money, you can come to Kadima Careers. We help you out with one-on-one coaching directly with me. We have a digital course that you can take all my knowledge and information and apply that to your career. We help you negotiate your job offer. We help you get promoted. We help you accelerate your career. So with that, dig into this podcast. At the end, leave us a review. Tell us what you liked, tell us what you didn't like, and most importantly, own your career. Welcome to another episode of the Sick Career Podcast, where I sit down with some very inspiring, diverse, empowering professionals to understand how they have achieved their career success, and more importantly, what advice they will give to you. And on today's podcast, I'm very excited to have Mita Mallick on the podcast. She is someone that I've been following on LinkedIn, which is how I meet pretty much everyone nowadays. And I was very impressed with her posts, her focus on diversity and inclusion and equality. And she has a great podcast also called Brown Table Talk, I believe it's called. And I listened to a couple of episodes of hers, and I was quite intrigued. So with that, let me hand it over to Mita, and she will introduce herself a little bit further about who she is.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited for this conversation. I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion thought leader. I'm currently the head of DE&I at Carta. I am a passionate storyteller. I have a podcast. I'm a podcaster, as you just mentioned, just like yourself. And I'm about to become an author, soon to be published. My new book called Reimagine Inclusion, Debunking 13 Myths to Transform Your Workplace, available on Amazon for pre-order right now. And the most important job I have, Alan, is mom, which is mom to Jay, who's 10, going on 20, Priya, who's 8, going on 18. So feel free to reach out to me with any parenting advice anyone might have. I am open to all unsolicited parenting advice.
So I have 3 kids that are 2 17-year-old boys, Jonah and Lucas, and Jasmine, that's 15. Mm-hmm. My advice is enjoy them while they're 10 and 8, because they will love you a hell of a lot more.
Oh, wow.
And they're going to love you as teenagers. So enjoy that time. But parenting is way out of the realm of my expertise, and you're probably figuring things out there too. So we will probably talk more about careers than we will about parenting, because I have not figured out the...
I'm sure there's some analogies for parenting and careers, but yes, let's get into it.
Well, my employees have always listened to me a hell of a lot better than my kids. So I don't know if I'm better at managing employees than children, or my kids are just more comfortable speaking back to me than employees or something like that. But either way, the kids have been tougher, but much more rewarding. So let's get into it first about what got you so focused and energized about the DEI space. And looking back on your history, and I'll just share with the listeners here who don't know your background, you have a very illustrious career. You went to Columbia undergrad, you got a Duke MBA, you worked at J&J, you worked at Avon, Pfizer, Unilever. Now you're head of diversity at a cool startup, Carta. What got you passionate about the DEI space at all those? Yeah, just love to hear a little bit about what has inspired you and your passion for this.
Well, it starts at the very beginning. Alan, someone recently asked me what my origin story was, which I think is a connection to Marvel, which I'm not really in the Marvel space, but it's really interesting. Like, what's your origin story? And it starts with being the proud daughter of Indian immigrant parents. My younger brother and I were born and raised in the US, and I grew up in a time and a place where it was not cool to be Indian. I'm sure some people can still relate to that, but I was the funny looking dark skinned girl with the long, funny looking braid whose parents spoke funny English until it wasn't funny anymore. And my peers reminded me every single day that I did not belong in that community. And I also didn't grow up in the Instagram era. So I didn't see a lot of people who looked like me in the media. And because I was painfully shy and introverted, I think those are two different things growing up. I read a lot, I wrote a lot, I watched a lot of TV and commercials and films, and I just wondered, like, who gets chosen and why? Like, who has the power of the pen? Like, who gets to be on screen? Like, I thought it was so fascinating as a young child because I didn't see many Black or brown people at the time on screen. And so I think, Alan, my entire life, I've believed inclusion is a driver of the business. And so I went into a very long career in storytelling. I'm still a storyteller, building brands with purpose. But no matter where I was, I would always ask the question, like, why aren't we heroing a Black model for this campaign? Why does this blush not work on my skin tone? Right? Like, why aren't we talking to these audiences? And so that was something throughout my career I had always thought about. And so when I was at Unilever and they asked me to take on being the head of diversity, equity, inclusion, my first bias, my first thought was like, well, I'm not going to do that. Like, I'm supposed to be like on this track to be a marketer. Like, why would I do that job? And it was my younger brother who reminded me, like, this is what you've been fighting for your whole life. Like, imagine if you could do that change within an organization at a much bigger scale. But we all have our biases, right? So I was like, why would I want this job? I'm on the track to be like a CMO. I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, and talk a little bit about your role there at Unilever. Unilever is a huge global company. What was your responsibility and remit and I see you had a few different titles there.
Yeah, my role evolved and it was great because I had a very strong marketing business background. So I brought that into the role. I was looking at what I like to think about end-to-end inclusion ecosystems. And I talk about this in Reimagined Inclusion. It is workforce is really important. You want to make sure that the communities in which you're operating in, you have representation in your workforce. And then that helps you with innovation. The second pillar really around how are your products and services showing up in the marketplace. So did a lot of great work with Dove and Ben and Jerry's, like really supporting them to think about like, how does your purpose coming to life in the marketplace? And who are you speaking to and who are you intentionally or unintentionally ignoring? And then the third is really around supplier diversity. Who do you write checks to and why? Do you write checks to the same people over and over again? And then the fourth is really you're seeing more and more in this marketplace values, right? Like it's very easy to put on Instagram as a company or as a leader, you support Black Lives Matter. And the question will be, how do your Black employees feel about that statement? And is that their internal experience of how they're experiencing the company? And so more and more, I think employees are saying, especially with Gen Z entering the marketplace, like you can say you stand for values, but when are you ready to stand up for them? And it's sometimes during those hardest moments that you have to stand strong and stand up for them.
I've seen companies make a lot of performative marketing spend and talk a big ass game about diversity and inclusion. Like right now, we're in the month of June as we're recording this, and almost 25% of brands have changed their logo to rainbow colors for this month. And in February, they talk all about Black History Month. And my former employer, Salesforce, spent a lot of money, I don't know how much, but to buy the URL equality.com. So if you go to equality.com, Salesforce bought that. That is purely marketing that they're doing that for. So
I did not know that. I learned something new today, Alan. Okay.
And if you go to that site, it's very splashy. It's very nice looking. There's very diverse individuals on that site, which was very different than my day-to-day professional relationships of people that worked at the company. For instance, I worked for Tableau's division, which was acquired by Salesforce, and there were 40 VPs or higher at Tableau, and only one was Black. 2.5% were Black. So they talk a big ass game, but they don't necessarily walk the walk. So like you've worked at some really impressive corporations. How do you think about the dichotomy between what companies are saying versus what companies are doing? And you don't need to say anything negative about any of your former companies that you work for. If you want to, you can. I'm cool doing that with mine, but you may want you may want to be more careful than I am.
I'm a half glass full
Yeah.
person. I know progress is slow. I'm going to stay on the positive space, but this is my advice to companies. Anyone listening who's in a leadership role, and we're all leaders, right? Thinking about how you can influence the work internally. Your employees are your forgotten consumers. We spend so much time thinking how much we're going to sell to, when, where, why, how, versus saying, okay, we want to do this big initiative for Pride, for February, for Black History Month, for Hispanic Heritage Month. Pick a month, right? Every month there's something. And the question is, let's start with our employee base. Let's ask these questions. Is this the experience of how employees feel working here? Before we're so quick to have a splashy campaign, press release. And so when I've worked at companies, I'm really careful about that balance. Let's talk about Pride for a second. If specifically sitting right now in the US, I know there's a global audience and this is happening globally too. The amount of anti-LGBTQ legislation that is out there right now, the hurt and harm that is being caused to this community. And so, and I will call lovingly this company out because I've written about it in Adweek, so you can find it publicly. Disney has made so much strides when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion. It really has changed from when I was growing up, from the content to the parks. There's lots of details we can go into. But then at the end of the day, the company is funding political action committees, right? They're funding anti-LGBTQ legislation. So that's the disconnect, right? And that's like, wow, because I think on the surface, and I think beyond the surface, they've made a lot of progress. But then you're like, how can you be doing that? And when I was at Unilever, I was very proud. We had a very hard no line. Our CEO then, we did not fund political action committees as a company. So if you're in the US, a political action committee is an opportunity for you to use company funding to support legislation that's happening in the US and also to support campaigns. And so that's where I think like this work is tough, it is hard, and you have to be all interconnected, all the players on the team within a company. Because guess what? Likely your government affairs is running the PACs. The marketers don't know that, right? And so there's all this like disconnect. Then HR is not involved. They would say, actually, we need to work, a lot of work to do on creating inclusive benefits for the LGBTQ plus community. Like, can we start with that before we decide to sponsor a Pride float in New York City?
Yeah, that's a great point. And on the PAC side, I've seen that from the inside of these companies. I was encouraged as an employee to get involved with the Google PAC, with the Amex PAC. They would encourage us. They wouldn't be able to pay us or like match donations, but they incented us. They're like, oh, if you want to come to these free drinks with Eric Schmidt, who was a chairman of Google,
sure.
If anyone who gives $1,000 or more to a PAC, like I forget exactly what the requirements were, but also at American Express, they encouraged us to give to the PACs as employees. I never took part in that, but these companies do have a disproportionate impact on society. Sometimes they use it for positive to call out some actions. One thing that Salesforce did that I was proud of, not while I was there, but they drew a very hard stance on Indiana and threatened to come out of there when Mike Pence was there. Something about LGBTQ rights back then when he was the governor. I don't know if the companies are taking as hard a stance now, because now they look at it more as a business decision, because if they piss off half the population, they're going to lose half of their consumers. So it's a delicate balance.
Sure, I agree with all that. And I think that's up to a public company CEO. They're going to decide that as a board, they want to fund political action committees. The question is, are you equitably funding people from both sides of the aisle? Okay, you are. But then what are you actually funding? So if you want to fund anti-LGBTQ legislation, and that's a choice you have made as a company, then you cannot, as I would say, have diversity dressing or pride washing, as you're calling out, and acting as if you are an ally in action to the community. Doesn't work both ways. It just doesn't.
You talk a lot about some of the challenges you had as a child growing up. And did you grow up on the East Coast in New York or New Jersey area?
I did. Yeah. I grew up in Massachusetts.
Okay. Massachusetts.
Yeah.
So East Coast, United States, and now you're in the New York area, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So fairly diverse area, probably more progressive part of not just our country, but the world. But you don't have that everywhere. You don't have that in corporations often. You have been able to go from an ostracized brown girl who did not see people like yourself as a child to someone who has gotten into some of the top universities in the world, gotten into the top companies in the world. But I'm sure you had a harder path than a white dude like me might have had. So I'd be curious to hear from your perspective some of those challenges that you have faced, and more importantly, how you have overcome some of those to be as successful and develop the impressive career that you've done over the last couple of decades or however long your LinkedIn profile goes.
Well, how much time do you have? How much time do we have to discuss this all? Well, I'm reminded of, I will bring up my 8-year-old daughter again. I'm reminded of a song that she's obsessed with right now. It is Taylor Swift, Antihero. And there's a line in it that says, "Hi, it's me. I'm the problem. It's me." And I can't stop thinking about that line, particularly as I've been editing my book and it's coming out in October. I keep thinking, I talk about in the intro how I was chasing inclusion my entire life, and I've still been chasing it, whether it was in my community, whether it was in workplaces, because I never thought that those bullies from the classrooms and schoolyards would follow me into corporate America. I was very naive. I went to great schools. I was privileged and lucky. Yes, I earned it. Parents supported me in that, but I was not prepared for the workplace at all. And so one of the things I have come to recognize is there are parts of me that I've brought to work, all the cultural gifts that my immigrant parents gave me that in a workplace has held me back. So being overly humble certainly didn't help me at work. As my dad would always say, keep your head down, work hard, stay out of trouble, you'll be recognized. That doesn't work in corporate America. This idea of like an extremely hard work ethic, Alan, I could outwork almost anybody, right? But I wasn't working smart. I was working hard, and I had a really hard time quitting things. And so right now, with the way the markets are, I tell anyone I'm talking to, you better be looking up to make sure what the company's priorities are. And if they have shifted, stop working on the stuff that's no longer a priority. Get on those projects that are, and stop quietly working on things that just don't matter anymore. And at the same time, I have come to recognize I have been working in systems and places, a world that was not built for me, a corporate America that was not built for someone like me. So I think those two things are what I've come to understand now. Like they're both colliding at the same time. So there's only so much I can control, which I have in terms of like my leadership development. But the truth is, I am operating in a world that was not built for someone like me.
And I think you use the term the myth of meritocracy. I don't know if you use those exact words, but people.
Yeah. Well, you took the words right out of my mouth. Yes.
There is, and maybe I use the word myth because and I do want to talk about the 13 myths, and not that we'll cover all 13 in your upcoming book. But there is this myth of meritocracy that people think that the best person will win. And there's very few places where that actually occurs. I think on the sporting field, it does. There are some biases associated there too. But I think once you get on a sports field, if you're the fastest runner, you will get the job. Or if you are the strongest athlete, you will get the job. But in Unilever or Salesforce or Google or wherever, it's kind of hard to say, is Mita a better head of DEI or is Alan a better head of DEI? And so then it gets to this gray area of who is going to get the job, who is going to get promoted, who is going to get fired, and so forth. So there's a lot of influence that one can do.
Yeah.
And some cultures and some people that I either believe that meritocracy is more prevalent, and there's some that just realize that meritocracy doesn't really exist, and let me politically figure out the way to the top. I'd love your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Yeah. As we get into the book, one of the myths is I'm all for diverse talent as long as they're good. And I bring up, it's like you already read the book, I bring up meritocracies in this because here's the thing. Meritocracies are a reflection of ourselves. And this is where bias comes into play. So let me give you an example. Let's say Mita and Alan are both being interviewed for a role. And in this role, during the interview process, I connect really well with the manager. We both went to Stanford. I'll pick on Stanford. We both played lacrosse. We come to discover that we both spent summers in Cape Cod as a child. All of a sudden, we have this connection. And then the manager says, I just really like her. She's just really going to be great at this job because we have so much in common. She's a reflection of me. And guess what? Guess what happens, Alan? I just speed her through
Yeah.
the process. She doesn't need to meet with all these people. But then I meet with Alan, and something I just can't put my finger on makes me uncomfortable about Alan. And so then I say to myself, I'm going to put Alan through 5 more rounds. I just need Alan to meet with a few more people. And so meritocracies, I believe, are also a reflection of what we define as good. And our bias really plays into that. And so that's why it's so important when you think about building processes in companies, making sure they're fair and equitable from the start. And so for this job, let's say it was for a brand manager role, it should be very clear, right, on how many interviews from the start. You tell the candidates you're going to meet with 5 people, here they are, and everybody is working off the same questions. And so when you have the debrief, what's going to happen? I'm going to be like, I just loved Mita. She's great for this job. I just loved Mita. And what Dee and I talk about in the Brown Table Talk podcast is facts versus feelings. I'm just talking about my feelings. So someone's going to push me to say, okay, I know you loved her. Tell us some more details about her background. And I've been in these debriefs where it's clear that you spend a lot of time getting to like and know the person, but where's the job description? Where's the experience? Let's get into the meat of what you talked about. And we were really busy talking about a lot of stuff we connected on that probably weren't about the job at hand.
Interviews are so biased. Promotions are so biased. And what you're suggesting is to have a structured interview process where maybe everybody is measured on a fair and even playing field with structured based interviewing. That doesn't happen outside of my experience at Amazon, which does
and it needs to happen.
Amazon does a fairly decent job with their structured interviewing. Google does a fairly decent job with their structured interviewing. But even there, I worked at Google. I saw the bias occur. I got hired at Amazon. I saw how the bias worked to my advantage. Like I basically played the process to benefit me. If you know that these biases exist and you have your role and you've worked in the industry to try to rectify the systemic biases there, they're not going to change anytime soon. So what advice do you have for people that are in your position, a woman of color and other people, to be knowledgeable about it, to circumnavigate them? And like, there's a lot of responsibility here on me as a white dude. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that in a second. But rather than be dependent on me as a white dude or people in charge to fix a system, which they've been doing a really shitty job of doing that quickly, what have you done, and what advice do you give to people?
Sure.
Because you've succeeded phenomenally, and maybe not as far as you could have got, like maybe not as far as you would have been if you didn't have to fight some of these biases. But what have you done to circumnavigate it?
I mean, listen, I know that I have to work twice as hard and twice as fast as most of the people I'm working with. That's just my entire life, right? So someone said to me recently, and I've heard this more than once in my career, wow, you're so ambitious, Mita. You're so ambitious. I'm like, okay, ambitious. And then I read my friend Maura's book, which is called The Anxious Achiever. Read it on a flight going to a work event, and it rocked my world, Alan, because I thought maybe I haven't been ambitious, but maybe I've just been anxious my entire career. Anxious that I wouldn't fit in, anxious that I wouldn't meet the standards, anxious that someone would find me out or think I wasn't good enough, because I was constantly navigating in places and spaces that I didn't belong. And so I sort of treated corporate America like I don't know, like I'm not an athlete, but on the field, right? Just practicing every day, excelling, getting the points on the board. I've been lucky to have a lot of great career sponsors, allies, because I'm tired of speaking up for myself. Like I do it as my day job, but if you're talking about me as an individual, we're all an ally for somebody, and we all need to be looking out for each other. Now, in my day job at Carta, or just as you think about the work of chief diversity officers, and honestly, it's all of our work, the best way you can interrupt bias, because here's the thing, the systems and processes, in some places they exist, in some places they don't. And to your point, you can still game the system, right? And so what's important is to be asking open-ended questions. Alan, tell me more about why you think Mita wouldn't be a fit for the role. You mentioned that you don't think she has the energy to keep up with this pace here. Can we go back to the comment in your review that you wouldn't put her up in front of a customer. Can you tell us more about that? Right? So if we can get people to move away from feelings to facts, that's where, in a safe way, listen, my job, I don't shame, name, blame, demonize people. That's just not how I do my work. It's just not who I am. But I try to get leaders to self-reflect by asking open-ended questions, because then Alan might say, you know what? I didn't spend enough time on that. Maybe I should go back and have another conversation. We didn't get to that, because then all of a sudden you're like, where are the facts? This is all based on like feelings about the situation.
Yeah. And you talk a little bit about you've been lucky to have some sponsors and allies and advocates along your path. Are there things that people can do to help create that luck as well? So is it just randomly going down the street and hoping that an ally finds you? Or
yeah, every time I say I'm lucky, people will remind me, you've earned it. You're not lucky, right? So but I do think, let me be honest, I think there's a balance of both in our lives and careers, right? There's putting in the work and like timing meets opportunity. But I love your question and what people can be doing. Say my name when I'm not in the room. If I'm not able to present, but it's my work you're presenting, say my name. If it's time for promotion review, compensation review, if you know me and know the work I've been doing, speak up on my behalf. Like that's what so many people have done. You know, Alan, when I first started my career in corporate America, one of my career sponsors, Gail Tifford, said to me, do you know who's talking about you when the doors are closed in your career? I said, doors are closed and people are talking about me? Yeah, I had no idea. I didn't know that everyone disappeared for 2 days and they were all in the conference room, your picture's on a slide and they're talking. I was like, what? So those are the things that I started to sort of understand the politics in corporate America. And some people will say to me, we talked about this in the podcast, like, oh my God, I don't want to talk about politics. I hate politics. I think politics is really, for me, about being situationally aware at work, which I wasn't. Politics for me is not about gossip and negative venting. Like, I'm not talking about that, but I'm talking about politics exists wherever human beings do. So just to be more aware about the power dynamics and structures and to say, oh, I actually need more career sponsors. Let me think about who I could reach out to. How can I show them the value of my work? Alan's not just going to sponsor me, but all of a sudden, if I think about, well, Alan's the CFO, and here I am working on this really big media analysis to see what our return on investment on spend was for the last year, I think Alan might be interested in that. And I think I could get a coffee with Alan. I could show him some of my analysis. Alan's going to give me some feedback. And over time, we're going to build a relationship. And guess what? Next time there's a closed door calibration session, Alan's likely going to speak up and say, you know what? I've been spending some time with Mita. I think this analysis was spot on. I'd like to propose that she gets this pay increase or she gets put on this task force.
Yeah. And that's so important to have those advocates in the room where you are not invited to or part of.
Yes.
Those calibration sessions, those performance management sessions, those interviews where they are deciding on your fate. It's important to be able to influence that to the extent that you can. And it's very dependent to build those, like to have advocates in your corner. And like, I try to do the best that I can. And like, I have ways to improve on that, but it's, but yeah, I've benefited also from advocates and people talking on my behalf in the room when I was not there. So we're running a little low on time. So I do want to talk briefly about your book, and you have 13 myths there.
Sure.
So like, let's summarize your book, that's coming out. Why'd you write it? What's it about? And give people a little tease about why they should pick it up when it comes out.
Well, I feel like our whole conversation was teasing up the book. So thank you for that. The book is called Reimagine Inclusion, Debunking 13 Myths to Transform Your Workplace, available for pre-order on Amazon right now. And I wrote it, Alan, because there's a lot of great books on the marketplace. I know you have a lot of amazing guests who come on the podcast, people who've written books, people who are doing great work in the leadership and development space. And I wanted to say all the quiet parts out loud. What holds us back from meaningful progress in the workplaces and the stories we tell ourselves that we hold on to, like we just talked about. I'm all for diverse talent as long as they're good. Another one of my favorite ones is our ad wasn't racist. It was simply a mistake, right? Let's let that sit for a second. Another one, which is a true story, happened to me. Why are you asking for a raise? Your husband makes more than enough money.
Oh God.
And so that one, again, to your example earlier, you can do pay equity measures. Many companies are doing this behind the scenes. You can have the systems and processes in place, and it all comes down to how leaders show up with their own bias when it comes to money and our relationship with money. And why is Mita asking for more money? She doesn't need
Right.
it. Right. And so that's the way in which I approached the book, because I wanted it to be, headlines that spill the tea, get people's interest, stories that are pretty evergreen. I think everyone's going to read these stories and be like, yeah, something like that has happened to me in the workplace, how we can debunk that myth and show up to do better and be better. When I talk about pay equity for a second, going back to that myth, there's a myth that white women and women of color don't negotiate. And in many cases, that's not true. We do negotiate. And when we do negotiate, we're dismissed and gaslit and questioned about why we're negotiating, right? And so that's the way in which I really want this to be a practical guide that anyone can go back to who's thinking about, how can I show up and do better at work tomorrow, right? Because if we each just did one thing differently at work tomorrow, imagine how different our organizations would be.
On the negotiation front, I see that all the time with the clients that I work with, because they are often anchoring their worth, what they're valued at, what they're currently getting paid. And because of the systemic biases that have always occurred, if they're a woman, if they're a person of color,
Absolutely,
they were probably underpaid for a variety of different biases. So that if you and I are going in for a job, maybe I'm thinking that, hey, I want to earn 300,000 because previously I earned 250. And you might be going for the same job and saying, I want to earn 200 because I was earning 150 before. And people are anchoring on lower because that's what they've been paid and that's what they've seen and that's what they've been valued at in the market, even though providing the same amount of work, same impact, and delivering the same sort of results for that organization. Two more questions as we finish this great conversation up, and we could go on, but what is one final piece of sick career advice that you'd like to share with my listeners?
I wish I had taken more risks in my career, Alan. Risks pay off. Like, I just always thought about my career as like a ladder versus as how Sheryl Sandberg has said, the jungle gym. My advice is go after the jobs that no one else wants. The unglamorous, the unsexy, the jobs you're like, why would I take this? And then go and kick ass, make it your own, put points on the board. And I've done this more than once in my career. And wow, then there's a line of people who want your job when you're ready to move on, right? So I think that's the flip in my head, is like, go after the things that are unexpected and go after the things where you can actually make impact, versus, as we started this conversation, it's like a fancy press release and it's like, oh, it's like a great title, huge company, but are you actually going to be growing in that role?
And I love that Sheryl Sandberg analogy. I was fortunate enough to work at Facebook while she was still the COO there. And she did give a lot of leadership talks to people. And I remember learning about the career jungle gym instead of the career ladder, which I think is so apropos and so spot on.
Amazing.
Last question. How can people find you, follow you, get in touch with you? Because you have so much wisdom to share and you only had 30 minutes here to share it. But if people want to find more about Mita and learn from your wisdom, how can they do that?
Please find me on LinkedIn, just like that's how we met. And I'm really grateful that we've gotten to know each other and that you reached out. So LinkedIn is my primary preferred social media platform. I have a defunct TikTok channel. Don't go look at that. And I'm on Instagram. But yeah, I see you on LinkedIn.
Great. Awesome, Mita. Well, thank you for the time. Thank you for the insight. Thanks for all the work that you do. And look forward to continuing to get to know you more on LinkedIn and off LinkedIn.
Yes. Thank you, Alan. Thanks for having me. I appreciate you.
Thank you. Hey, Acceleration Nation. I hope you enjoyed our last podcast with Mita Mallick. It was a great conversation. I learned a lot from her. It was really great to hear her perspective. I'm excited to get her book when it comes out, Reimagine Inclusion, Debunking the 13 Myths to Transform Your Workplace. And there's 13 myths in there. I think there's a hell of a lot more, but she starts with debunking those. She shared so much great information here on this podcast. And as you heard, she is definitely willing to be reached out to. So follow her on LinkedIn. I follow her. I reached out to her. I'm a big fan of hers. And also, please follow me on LinkedIn. You can check me out at Alan Stein. Look at me under Kadima Careers, or look at me under Google, or look at me under Facebook or Salesforce or any of the companies I worked at. And do follow me on LinkedIn. And finally, if you do want to work with me, I do provide one-on-one coaching through Kadima Careers to help accelerate your career, get you a great job quickly, confidently, and with lots more money. So just go to kademacareers.com. We can help you out there. And my last ask for you, and I promise this is the last one, if you like this episode, please rate and review it. And if you review it and you send me a picture of your review, I will give you a free LinkedIn profile review. So just get that to me. I'm not hard to find, and I will gladly give you a free LinkedIn profile makeover review. With that, have a great day and own your career.